Uh, just want to say thank you to everybody that's here today. I'm really excited to be here at NDC London. It's actually my very first time attending an international conference and also speaking at one. So lots of excitement and nervousness there, but more excitement than anything. My name, as you can see up here, because I tend to have a little bit of a lisp sometimes, so sometimes I mispronounce my own name, which is fun, especially when I picked my first name and last name. But today we're going to be learning about accessibility testing. And just for a little background, my experience in accessibility has come from working as internal IT with the American Printing House for the Blind in Louisville, Kentucky, where I currently live. As well as I've actually worked with a company that has some presence here in the UK called Good Maps, which they provide accessible indoor navigation and some outdoor navigation as well through mobile apps. And I'm also currently a accessibility engineer with CVS Aetna as a contractor, doing accessibility testing, reasonable accommodations, vendor accessibility assessments, just all over the place. And through that time, I've gotten to see a lot of the ways in which accessibility can open doors for people and benefit everyone. I've also seen how the lack of accessibility can be very isolating, very just demeaning at times if it's not there. And so that's kind of why I do this. I enjoy trying to help make people more aware of accessibility and why it's important, so that hopefully we can work towards just making life better for everybody. With that, I do just want to add a couple of little disclaimers here. Obviously, my experience in large part comes from my jobs. However, I do just like to say that I am not here as an official representative of any of my current or former employers. There's too much red tape when I decide to get paid by my employers to do this. So I enjoy being able to just do it as my own thing instead. Additionally, I do, because of discussing accessibility, talk a lot about legislation, like the legality side of it. And so I do just like to say that I am in no way professionally a lawyer or anything like that. Just because there can be a lot of legal problems if people think that you are a lawyer or a solicitor or anything of that nature. So just kind of an overview. We're going to kind of delve into a little bit of just what is accessibility, some of the little basics that are good to know just in general that help with understanding then why it is important to make things accessible. And then we're going to kind of go into okay, well, how do we do it? How do we decide what is accessible? And some of the important factors there before delving into accessibility test plans and processes that can help when you're trying to ensure things are accessible. And a little bit of some other details related to that before getting into some of the tools and resources that many of which you might already have at your disposal and not realize that are there. So with that, first, what is accessibility? When we're looking at accessibility, we're discussing how well can anyone pick up your application, access your website, your facility, documentation that you might have for your workplace, services that you might offer to people. How well can they both perceive that the information is there, interact with it or make use of it and understand what they're interacting with, what they're taking in, regardless of their personal abilities in any way, shape, or form. And then with that, of course, comes disability. Because of course, when we're talking about accessibility, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the impacts that it has when it comes to people who have disabilities, which unfortunately tends to put a lot of focus on what we call the medical model of accessibility or of disability, which of course, there you're looking at, with the medical model, you're looking at medical conditions. And that tends to be a lot of what our legislation, any kind of like legal government policies are based off of, is usually the medical model. But it kind of goes further. You'll hear a lot of accessibility professionals talk about what we refer to as the social model. And the big thing with the social model is that you are looking at it from the perspective that the environment itself is basically not really made for how truly diverse people can be. We tend to have this particular best case scenario, I guess you could say, user who we have in mind when we're building a facility, when we're creating a product. And that tends to narrow the scope of like how we build things. And the thing is, we're not all copies of one another. I mean, that's part of what makes life so amazing, is the fact that we are all so different. There are just so many different perspectives and lived experiences out there, but we're just not building things really for how diverse that is. And as a result, we kind of create barriers for people. The environment is creating this barrier that, had the environment been made for how diverse people are, wouldn't be there. It's basically putting the onus on the environment versus putting it on the person who is experiencing the barrier. And with that, we also have to kind of consider assistive and adaptive technologies, which, I say adaptive and assistive technologies, but really, it's any software, hardware tool that someone is using to overcome that environmental barrier, to mitigate it. And it can be as high-tech as a refreshable braille display, if any of you have ever seen those. They're really cool if you ever get a chance to see one. And it can be as low-tech as having tactile stickers that you put on your laptop to make it easier for you to remember what port is what, regardless of whether you're in the dark or if you're able to see it or not. It can just be it can be things like smartwatches. I usually have my smartwatch on today that I would use for helping to keep me on track when it comes to time, but didn't remember that. But it can also be like your glasses. If you have to wear glasses, those are assistive technology. I wear sunglasses a lot of times because I have light sensitivity problems. So that would technically be a form of assistive technology. So I brought up the social model of disability. And I bring this up because, we tend to really kind of have a narrow thought on like what we think of when we think of disability. We're thinking of, someone who is non-circadian blind, so can't perceive like light levels. Or we think of someone who is missing a limb. And that can kind of cause us to miss the broader picture of how someone can experience a disability, because in reality, disability is more of a spectrum. And in particular, I like to compare it to the electromagnetic spectrum. And I compare it to that because if you think about it, the electromagnetic spectrum is this huge, wide spectrum of wavelengths. But there's only this itty bitty little portion that is visible to us at any point in time. And that's kind of how disability is. The things that are obvious or visible are just like a small portion of it. And in reality, there's a lot of things out there, especially like when you're talking about like cognitive, but even with like physical disabilities. For example, because it's easier for me to speak to my own personal experiences, I actually have a spinal deformity. It's part of the reason I got a chair up here in case I need to lean against it. Most of the time I can be wandering about. I mean, I've been exploring London the last few days, and probably nobody really would have assumed that there was anything physically wrong. But other days, I might not be able to really stand up easily. I might be stuck sitting down the entire day because getting up is just way too painful. And that's how disability is. It's not this consistent thing. A lot of disabilities, they vary with how they're impacting someone's life, how obvious and not obvious. And just like with the electromagnetic spectrum, a lot of times it varies how obvious it is to different people. There's a saying amongst people who are neurodivergent that we tend to flock together. It's one of those things when you're kind of close into that community, it's a lot more obvious when you see someone out on the street for you that, oh, that person's probably neurodivergent too, versus someone who's not maybe had to deal with that as much throughout their life from a loved one or on a personal level might not realize it. They may make, unfortunately, very painful assumptions sometimes. And that's kind of, it's important to think of just how varied disability is and how easy it is to miss things that could be barriers. So with that, and that kind of feeds into like why it's important to make things accessible. Because if you think about it, you go into a workplace and let's say, if you were in a wheelchair and there's no ramps, there's no elevators, there's no escalators, nothing that you could potentially use to get around, you're not going to feel very welcome. You're not going to feel like anyone really wants you there because they're not making any kind of attempts to make it a place that you can be, that you can get around and do the things that everybody else is doing. And that's kind of like what can happen when you have like an inaccessible environment is you're not going to make people feel welcome. I ran into a problem when I was working at the printing house where I would occasionally I'd have to call tech support for a company, and without fail, I'd say, hey, I've got this application and the screen reader's not able to identify the different elements in your application, and so the person's not able to use it. They are someone who is low vision, so they can't see the buttons. They need the screen reader to be able to communicate that information to them. And without fail, I'd get the person that would say, okay, well, tab twice and they'll be able to see that this button is highlighted. No, they can't. They can't see that the button is highlighted. That's the entire point. And like it would go round and round and round. I once spent 3 months just trying to get a printer company to understand that because, even if someone can't see very well, they still are going to potentially need to print out contracts. They're still going to need to be able to print out forms and documents for their coworkers or just any number of things that they may need to print out. And plus, not all people who are low vision or blind, there's that assumption that, again, kind of talking about that narrow scope, there's that assumption that you say someone's blind and people immediately jump to, oh, well, they obviously can't see anything at all. When in reality, that's not the case. It's a spectrum. And so getting people to kind of understand that, it's painful. And in seeing that stuff happen, I kind of realized just how isolating, again, how frustrating and demeaning it can be when things aren't accessible. Because then you're sitting here and you're struggling with this idea that, like, I've got to ask someone to help me print out a paper. I've got to ask someone to help me find the bathroom. I have to ask for help to send an email. You know, these basic things that maybe day to day we just do without any real issue, without thinking about it. From a website perspective, the fact that, you know, if you are a sighted user, you tend to go to a website and you see how things are grouped, and you can make certain assumptions about the purpose or what information is on a page based on how things are grouped, how things are positioned on the page. And if the page isn't made accessible, someone who's not sighted isn't going to be able to get that same information. It's going to be like just handing them a block of text, and they aren't going to have any real direction. And so they're going to feel unwelcome. They're not going to want to patronize your site, your app, your services, your facilities. And so when we work to make things accessible, we're removing those barriers. We're allowing for people to have equal access. And through that, we're helping to make them feel welcome. We're going to improve retention because, again, if people feel welcome, they want to patronize your business, they want to work for you, and they want to stick around. And through that, you help to build this more diverse workforce. And when you have a more diverse workforce or a more diverse customer base, you're able to gather feedback that wouldn't have been accessible to you otherwise. You're going to be able to have people that are going to maybe notice an issue that you didn't realize that was there, and are going to be able to come up with solutions that you might not have thought about otherwise. And because of that, companies that are more diverse and more accessible tend to be a lot more innovative. They tend to be the ones that are coming up with the real, true, like, amazing ideas and concepts and these new things that, like, just were like make the world so much easier for everybody, that they wouldn't have come up with otherwise. And then obviously when you're trying to, like, make a business case for accessibility, you have to talk about, you know, dollars, which of course, you know, being more innovative, more progressive, obvious way that you're going to potentially be more profitable. But there's also the fact that when things are more accessible, you gain access to a really large market share that you might not have had access to otherwise. Because the thing is, now if we go by more medical model, like the World Health Organization and a lot of other similar organizations tend to put the percentage for how many people have a disability at any point in time at around 25, 26%. And you tend to see that be fairly the same regardless of where in the world you go. There's going to be some exceptions, obviously, maybe an area that's more polluted or that has unfortunately gone through a lot of war or other disasters. It might be higher, but otherwise, typically, you're going to have that about 25, 26%. And when we think about the fact that there's almost 8 billion people in the world, that's a lot of people who potentially you're missing out on if you don't have accessible services, products, facilities, and things of that nature. Now, granted, again, you think about the social model, it's honestly probably a lot higher than 25, 26%. That's just, again, that's going by that narrow thought of what disability is. If we actually expand it out to the wider perspective, it gets a lot bigger. Kind of to give like a sort of another example of like how much more broad the idea of disability can be. Think about a parent who is carrying around their child. While the child is in their arms, they have reduced mobility. They're not going to be able to get through doors as well. They're not going to be able to carry as much of anything else that they normally would. They're going to have maybe trouble getting up and down stairs. Those are all ways that they're technically experiencing disabilities. And unfortunately, there have been cases, I know like in the US, where, you know, if a facility wasn't accessible, something like that can be potentially fatal. There can be some really severe consequences. Think of on a construction site when the large equipment is running. And as a result, they're having to wear, hopefully, if they're, you know, following proper safety protocols, they're wearing hearing protection, which of course means then they're not going to necessarily hear someone yelling at them to warn them about something. So they need to have like visual warnings or haptic feedback sort of warnings to help them. Because again, otherwise there can be some pretty severe consequences. So going from there, okay, we know we need to make things accessible. How do we decide kind of what constitutes accessible? Well, typically, especially if you're like looking at it from a business perspective, we start with the legalities, you know, the regulations, the government policies, the things that we're going to get fined by and that are going to really open us up to lawsuits if we're not, you know, compliant with them. This can be things like the Equality Act of 2010, the European Accessibility Act, which will go into, if I remember correctly, I think it's January, somewhere mid-January of next year, formally goes into effect. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act in America. And I list all these different ones because the thing is, like, even if it doesn't directly impact you based on where you live, many people are offering services to other countries. They are providing information, facilities to different countries. And as a result, while it's, you know, typically you want to be like really, really aware of your local regulations, it's also good to have some awareness of other ones that might potentially apply to you. Now, laws are only going to go so far, and the laws are typically based off of, from there, various guidelines and standards, which hopefully have been, you know, informed by people with disabilities or professionals who have a wider understanding of accessibility. We hope. These are probably the most common one that you'll hear about is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines by the World Wide Web Consortium, or W3C. Granted, the thing with that one, and this is like a problem, of course, with like any kind of guideline or standard, is, you know, they tend to apply more, I mean, it's in the name, web content. It's meant to apply to digital content that you would access via the web. And even then, it's got its limitations. With the introduction of, it's also known as WCAG, but WCAG 2.2, you know, there's been a little bit more of an improvement on understanding how web content and the way it's made can impact cognitive disabilities, or how it applies differently in mobile environments. But it's not a catch-all. It's not this exhaustive set of guidelines. It's a starting point. Even in the WCAG guidelines, and even with a lot of these other ones that I've got listed here, such as the International Standards Organization has a lot of different standards that apply to accessibility. The Portable Document Format Universal Accessibility, or PDF/UA, and the Accessible Electronic Documents Community of Practice. All of these different kinds of standards and guidelines, they're all starting points. They shouldn't be the only thing you go by. And they should be informed, like what you build upon what you learn from those with experience and user feedback. Because the thing is, at the end of the day, users are going to be the ones who are dealing with these barriers on a daily basis. They're going to be the ones who are going to be able to point out to you the little little catches that you might not have noticed otherwise. One in particular, which, before I continue, I do want to forewarn one of the images I have on the next slide. It shouldn't be an issue here since I'm not scrolling it, but it has the potential to have a pseudo flashing effect. And if you've ever noticed this, like maybe you've been on like a mobile, it's because it's especially common on like mobile devices that you'll see this. But if you've ever been scrolling on a website and there's almost like that flicker effect, even though nothing's actually animated, that's what I mean when I say like a pseudo flashing effect. But this is a very, very good example of why user feedback and experience is so important. On the left is the original Disability Pride flag. It's kind of a nice little neat design with the different color bands representing different forms of disability, including, I think, cognitive and vision and things like that. But the problem was when it was initially introduced, and I think it was in 2019, and it was made by someone with a disability. So, I mean, even people with disabilities, sometimes, again, you're more aware of the things that impact you specifically. You're not necessarily going to be as aware of the barriers that there might be in place for other people. Shortly after it was introduced, they realized that because of sort of the zigzag pattern and the vibrant colors, whenever someone would view it on a mobile device or scrolling on a page, it would create this pseudo flashing effect. And it's kind of bad to have a disability pride flag that can potentially cause problems for people with epilepsy. Just not a good look. And that's why about 1 or 2 years later, they introduced the new design on the right here. And it's a little bit more muted, still very, wonderful colors. They straightened it out, and that way it's more visually safe. You'll also see this happen if you see sites like, companies will have their branding colors. One in particular I know of that I've worked for in particular has a tendency to have a very large chunk of a bright, vibrant red. And of course, you have those giant chunks of like bright colors, and that just can be a little visually overwhelming. And again, when you're scrolling, it can also result sometimes in a flicker effect that can be quite problematic. So this is why, you want to get this user feedback. You want to get learn from experience and keep track of that and kind of have that inform whether it's your testing, your development practices, how you build documentation. It's very important to have that sort of in the back of your mind and in your built into your processes. Another good example, and this is one I just learned about here recently doing accessibility testing in my day-to-day, when you have different combinations of like assistive technologies. So for example, with screen readers, you'll tend to see users prefer one combination of browser and screen reader over another, depending on what environment they're working within. On macOS, with VoiceOver and Safari being used, which VoiceOver is the screen reader that is built into macOS, and Safari is the built-in browser for Mac OS. With that, if you have a list on a website, and you'll see this a lot of times, especially when people have like their navigation links at the top of their page, you put it in a list because it is a list of links, but then they'll display it in line and they'll remove like any kinds of bullets or other list stylings that would normally be present, which is perfectly fine. It's a completely valid way to do things as long as it's something where it's still visually apparent and semantically correct that you're using a list. The problem is on macOS, if you're using Safari and VoiceOver and you remove the list stylings, VoiceOver has a tendency to completely ignore the fact that that's a list. Now, visually, that's not going to cause a problem for most users. But if you're using a screen reader or, say, like a voice navigation sort of assistive tech that would normally label the elements on the screen based on what they are, it becomes problematic. Because a screen reader user, obviously, again, more likely than not, they are low vision or blind, and so they're not going to necessarily be able to immediately tell how many elements are in the list. So what they depend on is when their screen reader gets to the list, it says list with 6 items. And maybe there's like a label that you attach to the list that helps to identify what those elements are. And then when they go through the list, they usually hear list item 1 of 6, list item 2 of 6. So that way they know how far into the list they are, or they can choose to get out of the list and go to like what's beneath it instead. So if they're not getting that information, suddenly they're not able to navigate that way. They're not able to get that extra context information that they're not able to get visually. So this is something like I had no idea about this until I started talking to people who day to day use screen readers, and it's like, oh, okay. And it also helps to inform, because there are workarounds, and so that's another thing. You also get to learn those workarounds that they may be aware of that you're not. Now, that all kind of goes into now, obviously, okay, well, we want to do the testing for accessibility. How do we start building our test plans and our processes that we can use to ensure that things are accessible? You can start with any kind of guidelines, and this can be, we can, again, this doesn't just necessarily apply to testing websites. This can be applied to testing physical spaces. But, you can use existing guidelines because a lot of them, they're typically laid out with a nice little pattern that you can actually make test cases just based on that, or at least start. Another important thing is shift left and include throughout. Usually you'll just hear people say shift left, but I like to include that include throughout part, because shift left means that you include it as early in the process basically as possible. So have accessibility in mind from the very, very beginning. Because you can have, for instance, accessibility testing. We have test plans where I work that apply just to designs. So we'll look through designs and we'll actually point out things ahead of time visually. We'll be like, hey, you need to be aware of this, 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 and this in order to avoid turning this beautiful design you have into an accessibility nightmare. And then you want to include it throughout because, if you just are talking at the design stage, but you're not doing any testing in between or after you've gotten whatever you've got out into the wild, into production, there's always that chance that you're going to miss something. There's going to be something that catches you up and you miss, and then it's just a nightmare. And by having it throughout, you're increasing that chance that you're going to catch it early when it's cheaper and it's easier to fix. Because it's always easier to fix something before it becomes a problem than after you've got a lawsuit on your door. There's also the saying in the accessibility community, nothing without us. And in this case, what that means is including the people who actually have the lived experience, including people who using a screen reader is their day-to-day method of navigating the web, of navigating digital documents. Include people who their day-to-day life is navigating the world in a wheelchair. Because you can do all the simulations in the world. You can be as aware as you want of how a screen reader works, but unless that's your day-to-day life experience, you're just not going to be, again, aware of like all those little gotchas, those little moments that you wouldn't run into otherwise. Those little combination features, as some companies will call them, that would cause problems. Because you're just not going to be using whatever assistive technology or interacting with the environment in the same way. And then there's the whole manual versus automated. Now, don't get me wrong, I love automated tests. Automated tests are great. They make life a lot easier when they're used correctly. But automated tests are only going to catch so much. And I've actually got a really good example of like that on the next slide. So I'll touch more on that here in just a bit. When it comes to anything digital, screen reader and keyboard accessible. Now, obviously, not everybody who's using assistive technology is using a screen reader. Not every person who is using assistive technology is only using a keyboard. But when you make sure that things can be read accurately and communicated to the user appropriately via these methods, that they can navigate it successfully, basically what you're doing is like, at least with digital content, which obviously is like the sort of the focus. That's the part of like accessibility testing I have the most experience with. You're basically making sure that it's machine parsable, because the thing is when it comes to digital content and assistive technology, it's all a machine is reading it, it's interpreting it, and it's communicating it to the user. And we're making sure that one, the machine can actually parse it. We're making sure that it's able to parse it correctly and it's not misidentifying things. And typically, if you're making sure that digital content is screen reader and keyboard accessible, you're not capturing the whole experience for all your users, but you're greatly increasing the chances that they're all going to get a more consistent understanding of it, a more consistent experience with it. And then there's avoiding it works on my machine. Well, great, let's ship your machine out to every single user out there. Obviously, no, that doesn't work. And with that, what I'm meaning is just that you want to test on multiple different combinations. And you also want to, any test plan, any process you come up with, you want to make sure to kind of also take into account where is the end, like where in the end are people going to be interacting with it. Because for instance, I'm going to test a mobile application very differently than I am something that is only available on desktop web. But then I'm also going to have to test it differently if it's going to be on both, because now I've got to make sure it's going to work properly on both. If it's something that's going to be in an embedded system, Obviously, there's going to be limitations on what kinds of accessibility equipment can potentially, assistive technologies can be used with that. So that's going to impact things. If it's on like a smart TV, you're also having to deal with like the different custom operating systems that come into play there, and having to take into account, okay, how is someone going to expect this to navigate? How do things need to be communicated? And that kind of is another limitation when you're talking about like the different guidelines. Because for instance, the WCAG is more built for websites, and in particular websites on desktop web. You're not going to interact with something on a mobile device quite the same way as you are on the desktop. You're not going to be interacting with something on a smart TV the same way you would on a desktop. And so you have to like make adjustments there to like how you're testing, how you're considering what is accessible and inaccessible. And then learn from the experience of others. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't like feel like you have to start from like absolutely nothing. There are tons of people who have come before me, who have come before any of you, who have already like built a foundation that we can then grow from. We can then further. For instance, a couple of good examples are Visa actually has their VGAR, or Visa Global Accessibility. I got my little notes here because I always forget what the acronym is. And watch me have not put it in here. Nope, I did not. Yay. I did good for myself there. It's right here. Visa Global Accessibility Requirements. And basically with that, it's essentially like this whole test plan that's already out there, and it's got a list of tools. And sure, you're going to have to like kind of customize it for your own environment or what platform you're working on. But again, at least with that, you're not starting from nothing. The US government has the Section 508 ICT testing baseline for web. And again, it's a fully built, fleshed out desktop web test plan that you can just start with and then just edit to how you need it. DQ has, with their Axe Dev tools, there's actually, and Microsoft's Accessibility Insights has something similar. They have a manual test plan that's like just built into their applications, and you can pull from that and then build off of that. Now, I mentioned that I had a good example of manual versus automated, and kind of why you don't want to purely focus on automation. Because the thing is, automation can give you, especially with accessibility, there's so much of it that is subjective. So for instance, an automated test is not necessarily going to know, like it can look at all the images I have on a page, and it can say, okay, is there the role of presentation? Is there a null alt attribute? Both of which would indicate that an image is decorative. Or is there a alt attribute that has a value? It's going to be able to check for those kinds of things, but it's not going to know, well, did you just mark a informative image as decorative, just so you would not have to worry about it? Which is not going to affect your visual users, but someone that doesn't have the visual context is now missing out on part of the website experience, or on an email experience, or a document experience. It's not going to know if that alt attribute value actually communicates the purpose and the intent of that image correctly. Or is it just gibberish? Did you just like go through and put your dog's name for all the alt attribute values? I mean, unless all those pictures on that page are of your dog, it's not going to really be useful. So I think, yeah. So on here, I have 3 copies of the same website. The first one is like a good site example, and I say that loosely, then a bad site example, and then kind of a didn't really try. Now with the first one, the good site, on the back end of it, I've got proper semantic HTML. So I've got like header, footer, main. I have alt attributes on all my images. My lists are all actually lists. All that kind of good stuff that would then help someone who's using assistive technology navigate it. The bad site example is all divs, just divs, nothing meaningful. I think I have like a list element in there, and that's like the only like real semantic HTML. The only reason it visually looks the same as the good one is I used styles to like give all the headings their proper styling and that kind of thing. And then on the meh site, I just have the text. It's all in like divs, and there's like just no attempt, not even the styling to make it. So it's just a giant blob of text and images on a page. No structural, visual or programmatically. But as it goes through it, I then do Axe Dev Tools, and I just run the automated tests on all three of them. And they all score perfect. So we're done, right? Perfectly fine. Send it to production. Obviously, no. Because there's going to be very different experiences. The first one, both visual or non-visual users are going to get the same, generally, information out of it. The second one, visual users will get a good experience. Non-visual users are going to be left going, what in the world is this nonsense? And then on the third one, everybody just gets to have a bad day. But again, that's why you can't just solely do automated testing. It's not going to catch all those things. Now, when we're doing our test plans, we've got our test plan put together, but now okay, well, what kind of tools are we going to use for doing our testing? Well, the good thing is there are just a ton of different tools out there, and you can find something that's going to work for you and for your environment pretty readily. For instance, you have tools built into your operating system, regardless of whether you're using Mac, Windows. I don't have it listed in here, but even if you're using Linux, there's a screen reader available. There's different tools and stuff available, settings available that you can make use of. Any browser you're using is going to have built-in, typically, accessibility check options. Again, those are typically automated, but automation can still give you a nice starting point to get an idea of issues. There's a lot of different desktop applications out there. Some of them will cost money, but there is a huge wealth of them out there that are free, that aren't going to cost you a single penny. And some of them are even open source, so if you are so inclined to, you could even get them and customize them some. For instance, Electronic Arts actually recently open sourced a whole bunch of their accessibility testing tools. So they're just out there for anybody to use. They even open sourced one that is a flashing and animated content checker to help identify if something is flashing enough that it could potentially cause problems for people that have epilepsy or other sorts of conditions where that might be a problem. There's also a ton of browser extensions and web apps that are, again, completely free to use and will give you a very good opportunity to see potential issues that you might have, or to see if something is fine. There's bookmarklets, which all a bookmarklet is, you'll typically see it, it's where you can drag it to the bookmark bar in your browser, and it's kind of like running an application, an extra browser extension in a way. It's usually like a little JavaScript that'll run and it'll check different things. Some of them are very fleshed out to the point of basically being their own little applications. There's tons of books, be it ebooks or physical books, whatever is your preference. And then there's just a wealth of information. Again, kind of going back to the idea of like, learn from others. There are tons of articles, blogs, support pages where you can get so much information to help you with figuring things out. That's how I find out sometimes if something is a known issue versus being an issue that we created. So like for instance, with looking at like built into your browser, both Mac and Windows have an accessibility section to their settings. This has things such as options for the built-in screen reader. It has color filters, scaling options, all that kind of fun stuff. And the nice thing about using some of these built-in tools like this is, this is probably some of the same stuff that your users are going to be using. So you're going to be more likely, if you're using some of these, you're going to get more of a experience akin to what your user would actually experience. And they're free. So, you've already had to pay for the operating system in the computer. Make use of it where you can. Similar with the browser. You've got a lot of different like accessibility settings. Your dev tools in any browser can be a wealth of information. I use my dev tools all the time to go in and like change little snippets of HTML to try to see if I can figure out, okay, is this something with the browser? Is this something we're doing? And is there a workaround that will work? One of my personal favorites in Chromium-based Edge and in the Chrome browser itself, there's actually these wonderful emulate vision deficiencies settings under rendering. It's accessed via, there's like you go into like the dev tools and there's a more tools option where you can access these. And the nice thing about it is like, it'll do like the color filters to give you an idea of, okay, if someone has certain kinds of color blindness or blurred vision, again, simulations are not going to be perfect, but they can give you an idea of kind of what kind of experience your users are going to have. They also have, it's not perfect, but there are some options in there where it'll try to highlight potentially flashing content to give you an idea of like sections of the page you might need to be aware of, as well as a lot of other wonderful tools. Now with desktop applications, one of my personal favorites here on the left is the color contrast analyzer by the Picello group, or I think now they've just put it as TPGI. Completely free tool. And it's just great for giving you an idea. In particular, I like the fact that it actually gives you the different levels of accessibility conformance, like with WCAG. And it goes through and actually explains what they are and gives you an idea of like how it would pass or fail potentially based on the color combination. Which, speaking of like the different levels of conformance, that's one thing to kind of watch out for with any of the guidelines, and especially like with WCAG, since that does tend to be the one that a lot of people reference the most. With WCAG, you've got A, AA, and AAA. A level, anything that's labeled as A level conformance is the stuff that absolute bare minimum, even if you're not really pushing for it, you should be at least meeting those compliance guidelines. It's like bare minimum, like color contrast and things like that. AA is like the good sweet spot, kind of. It's typically what a lot of like any kind of digital regulations that governments have tend to be based around the AA compliance. And then AAA, is kind of the nice to haves, or like maybe things that you can try, but you shouldn't like sweat it. You're probably not going to meet all of them because there's a higher likelihood that they're not going to apply to your content. That would be like, for instance, offering a sign language interpreter for videos. Well, if you don't have any videos, that's not going to apply. But then also, it just might be something that if it's a small nonprofit, they might have more difficulty, and so they could fall back on like audio descriptions, captions, things of that nature that are A and AA conformance levels. And then there's also some issues with with AAA, where in trying to meet one of the AAA conformant guidelines, you can actually cause yourself to fall out of compliance with some of the other ones. And so there's kind of that's why A, AA are the ones that you definitely need to be meeting. AAA is the meet them if you can, or if they apply to your audience. The one on the right here currently is out of date slightly, but depending on your environment, it might still work. And they are supposed to be upgrading it soon. Last I checked with one of the developers, they said they'd gotten a grant to be able to update it. But it is the Photoepileptic Analysis Toolkit, I think. Or tool. Photosensitive Epilepsy Analysis Tool. And it's by the Trace Center from the University of Maryland. And it is a flashing content sort of analysis tool. So basically you start it up, you tell it to start recording, and it'll start recording when you open an active browser window, and then it'll record, and then you have it analyze it, and it'll tell you if it notices things that are flashing too much that would potentially cause problems with people that have photoepilepsy or photosensitive epilepsy. Now, with browser extensions, there's a lot of them out there. First one that I like to try to bring attention to is Microsoft's Accessibility Insights. It's free, it's open source. It's actually based on Axe Core by DQ to some degree, but then it just has this extra features and things that Microsoft has tailored for it that are wonderful. I like Accessibility Insights more. I do also still like Axe Dev Tools, but it doesn't hurt that I've actually contributed to the repo for this one, so no bias there. But it does have wonderful automated tools, which are the FastPass ones, and then there's the assessment, which has the automated tests, but then also has this nice manual guided test plan, which again is something where if you're building your own test plan, that can be something that you can gain inspiration from. And then there's the ad hoc tools, which are a set of tools for color contrast and analysis and analyzing a few different things. And you can use those with some of the manual tests. Or you can use it if you're just trying to confirm the results of an automated test. And then Axe Dev Tools. Again, kind of a similar sort of layout. We have the automated, hit the wrong button. We have the automated tools here, but then there's over here we've also got a tab for guided tests, which are our manual tests. And then there are some different tools built in. The one thing with Axe Dev Tools is that really it's a limitation on it and on Microsoft Accessibility Insights. There are some things with Axe Dev Tools that are only available if you have the premium, which I kind of don't like because it's kind of pricey. But again, they're wonderful tools. I've actually used the free trial for them, and I wish I could afford to use them all the time because so many of them are just awesome. But just something to keep in mind. And again, like I mentioned, like with web apps too. So there's also this nice Wave tool, and it's available as a extension and as a web app. So you can have it where it's just up in your browser, or you can like right click on the page and it'll say wave this page, and it'll do a little quick accessibility assessment, and it gives you this nifty like little summary of like what's going on, followed by an overlay kind of on the site that you can refer to sort of get an idea of like where these issues might be. Now, it is kind of important to note with any of these, whenever they put like the little symbols on the page of where something is, it's not always physically where something is. A lot of times it's because it's highlighting kind of where that code falls in the overall DOM of the web page. And so it might like put a box up here in the top corner, but really it's some element that expands and collapses or is not even visible at all that you have to be aware of. There's also the W3C markup validation services. Now, one thing with this is it's mostly with the markup validation, it's looking for parsing errors. And the thing with those is not all parsing errors are actually going to be true accessibility issues. Because all with parsing errors is it's looking for, do you have your closing tags on there correctly? That kind of thing. So they're good to like sort of verify. And also parsing was actually removed in WCAG 2.2, so kind of something to be aware of. Bookmarklets, I kind of mentioned these earlier. Again, these are tools that you can just click and, okay, thank you. These are just like little tools that you can drag into your bookmark bar and be able to run them to see potential issues on a page. Let's see. I will say these slides are all going to be available after the presentation. So if you don't get to take a picture of something, don't worry. All of this stuff is like linked within my speaker notes. So and in the slides themselves, so that you can get to them if you want. This one, since I'm a little short on time now, this one is the Andy bookmark by the Social Security Administration in the U.S. And it's an example of how like a bookmarklet can end up being almost a full-fledged app. It's got these nifty little module options that you can pick out for like tables, frames on a page, focusable elements, things like that to check for different things. There's this, for instance, like this nice little nifty headings bookmarklet that'll go through and it'll actually highlight the headings on your page, and that can be a good way to tell, okay, do you have a proper order to your headings? Have you actually used heading elements for your different headings, or did you just make them divs and make them bold? And then books. In particular, I like to draw attention to the Inclusive Components book by Hayden Pickering, especially because if you go to Google and you just search for Inclusive Components and Hayden Pickering, there's actually a Inclusive Components webpage, and it's the entire book, but as a free-to-access webpage. So you can get the book for free from the author. There's also, again, like, learning from other people, there's so many different options out there for resources that you can reach out to. It's limitless, really. You can basically just like search out there and you will find stuff for days where people have pointed out potential issues, given solutions, explanations for how to test for different things. You name it, it's out there. And with that, I'd like to say again, thank you for everybody who came today or who's watching via live stream. And here I've got this nice QR code that goes to my link tree where you can find the repository where I have the slides stored on GitHub, as well as just a slew of other resources out there that you can make use of.